What war was like in every time period. War and violence has been a timeless theme throughout human history. And although war never changes, some aspects of war do. Specifically, fighting styles, weapons, motivations, and other stuff like that. So today, let's learn why and how war evolved over time. The Stone Age. Technically, there isn't much evidence for war in the Stone Age. But I mean, come on. Does anyone think that humans who have been committing atrocities against each other for all of recorded history somehow all of a sudden were just peaches because they were cavemen? Like I said in the beginning of the video, war and violence is just part of the human condition. Thus, it's fair to assume that we still had wars before most of recorded history. And yes, that includes amongst cavemen. And I'm not just pulling this out of my cave, man. There's archaeological evidence for this. But first, what generally started wars in the Stone Age? Well, in the Paleolithic era, prehistoric people were thought to be nomadic, so they didn't really settle down and stay in one place. Because of this, there wasn't much of a reason to go to war. Resources weren't really seen as being one tribe or another tribe's possession, because in order to possess a river, for example, you'd have to live there and make sure that nobody else had access to it. However, in the Neolithic era, which is 10,000 BC to 2200 BC, tribes started to settle down into territories, which makes the potential for war breaking out much more probable in this time period. A lot of this remains speculation because there isn't enough evidence, but some of the proposed causes for war in the Stone Age would include disputes over territory, food, water, and even fights over women. I mean, think about it. If your average low IQ Chad is fighting his best friends over some random woman, imagine how an entire group of savage-ass mammoth-hunting cave gooners would behave. One terrible event that is speculated by historians to be caused by war is the Talheim Death Pit, which dates back to around 5000 BC. In this location, archaeologists found a pit filled with 34 bodies that looked like they were massacred. And if you include the outer ditch of the grave, there were 67 skeletons in total, all of which seem to have blunt force weapons used on their skull. In this site, researchers also found something that looks like a flat wooden paddle called a Thames beater. And no, cavemen weren't getting freaky with this thing. They used these glorified bonk sticks to baba booey their enemies into oblivion. Now, researchers have really only two theories about this event. One of them is that one village took over another to inhabit it. Another theory is that there was a small-scale civil war in the village, and just like Squid Game, the losers died. But they didn't just get their organs harvested here. The losers of this Stone Age battle ended up in a giant skeleton hole. And I'm not just talking about someone's freaky granny here. I'm talking about an enormous grave that looks like it was constructed for the Jolly Green Giant. Interestingly, only about 7 females aged 13 to 40 were found in the grave, which suggests that they may have been abducted. Besides the earlier weapons I mentioned, Neolithic fighters used axes and hammers made of wood, stone, and animal bones. Sometimes they even used farm tools that doubled as weapons. Talk about ingenuity. As we saw from the gravesite, Stone Age war was barbaric, brief, and brutal. And historians hypothesize they preferred guerrilla-style warfare, which, I'll be honest, sounds a lot better than doggy-style warfare. These wars likely either took place in resource hotspots like rivers, tribal villages, or luxury caveman real estate, such as a nice cave. If you think Vietnam-era guerrilla warfare is scary, imagine picking berries in a field somewhere around your village, and then out of nowhere, 200 cavemen incoherently yelling Baba Booey, getting ready to spank your sorry ass with a glorified paddle that would make your Bapsha's slipper feel like a down feather pillow. Doesn't sound fun to me. But if you're feeling like an angry caveman with too much testosterone lately, today's sponsor will give you the perfect outlet to unleash your psychotic roid rage built up from all those times your wife's boyfriend stole your lunch money. That's right, I'm talking about World of Tanks. And if you're a fan, trust me bro, then you've seen this game before. But what you probably haven't heard of is that this game has over 600 different tanks, ranging from the early 20th century to the Cold War period. And each of them were meticulously researched and accurately recreated so that any tank you choose works just like its real-life counterpart. That being said, this game isn't just that one tank minigame on Wii Play, because thinking strategically will determine whether you're a level 1 noob or the modern-day Napoleon Bonaparte of tanks. No, but seriously, some players in this game have so much 4D chess level strategy that Alexander the Great probably would have played it in his free time. But not to worry, my fellow 9,000 IQ tank strategists. You won't need the wealth of Alexander the Great to get started, because World of Tanks is free to play. And if you click the link in the description and use code COMBAT, new players will receive 250,000 credits, the Tiger 131 German heavy tank, T-78 American tank destroyer, and Chinese premium light tank for 10 battles each. Cromwell B Tier 6 British Premium Medium Tank for unlimited battles, and 7 days of premium access for free. And if you've played before, don't stress, because returning players will get a free 7-day rental of the Premium Centurion Tank, 3 days of complimentary premium access, and a free checkered camo skin to sneak attack your enemies. And to returning players, if you already have the Centurion tank, then you'll receive 100,000 credits for free. So if you want to increase your strategic combat skills, click the link in the description box below and use code COMBAT to download World of Tanks today for free. Thank you so much, World of Tanks, for sponsoring this video. The Bronze Age. Now that we're in the Bronze Age, we certainly don't have to worry about a lack of evidence because this era has plenty of warfare to cover. In the Bronze Age, society began to see major civilizations starting to organize for the first time, and many historians view this as the dawn of warfare and conflict. Well, official warfare and conflict. As these societies grew more complex and organized, and especially without thousands of years of experience in trading and international business, when one civilization had resources that the other wanted, most leaders' best idea was just to wage war. What resources, you may ask? Well, to begin with, most of the Minecraft basics. Think land, metals, water, loot, and trade routes. Okay, trade routes aren't really in Minecraft, but you get the point. Anyways, quick tangent here, but most people don't consider the importance of rivers in ancient cities. Like all civilizations, rivers and access to water weren't just a want for a booming economy, they were a requirement. Rivers provided reliable access to scalable trade, drinking water, agriculture, and even seafood. And unlike most resources, you can't just trade a river. Thus, war was a natural consequence. One of the biggest wars that took place in the Bronze Age was the Battle of Kadesh. And by studying it, we can gain some insight into what war was like in this time period. But first, does anybody remember the story of Moses in the Bible? Well, the leader of the Battle of Kadesh was Ramses II, which is the same pharaoh from the story of Exodus in the Bible. Although it has been said this battle took place a couple decades before the time period of Exodus, when the pharaoh was younger and probably still better at fighting. You see, Ramses II wasn't happy with all of Egypt's L's in the past century, as Egypt was losing territory to its neighboring empires. So, like all ancient leaders who considered themselves to be gods, Pharaoh launched a wide-scale campaign to regain Egypt's lost territory to restore it to its former glory. Anyways, the Hittites didn't like this, so they made up their own army to counter the Egyptians heading for their land. This story gets long, so I'll try to summarize it the best I can. Two Hittite spies lied to the Egyptians and told them that their army was far away. And for some reason, the Egyptians totally believed them. The Egyptian army set up camp to chill for a bit. And then, a little while later, the Hittites straight up ambushed them. With no time to prepare, the Egyptians had to improvise with their strategy on the fly. And in a matter of minutes, the Hittite army pretty much broke the Egyptian army into pieces. Now, once the Hittites saw that the army was broken up, they got greedy and started plundering the nearby enemy camps for that sweet Egyptian loot. Now, at this point, I'm guessing Ramses was feeling embarrassed and upset because somehow, against all odds, he escaped from the Hittites surrounding him and reunited with his army. This was probably possible because the Egyptians had lighter and more maneuverable chariots, which gave them a huge competitive advantage in battle over the Hittites' heavy chariots, which probably had the modern-day acceleration equivalent of a Mitsubishi Mirage. Now, I know all of this because Ramses II actually had hundreds of fanboys who sat around all day writing poems about him, like the ancient equivalent of a K-pop stan. Either way though, I respect the rulers in this time period because they actually fought with their army in the battles that they waged, which is pretty cool if you ask me, because no world leaders do that anymore. In the end, it was speculated that nobody really won this battle on either side. Apparently, the war created the world's first peace treaty though, which is pretty cool. If you were fighting a war at this point in history, you'd better hope that you had a good army because without it, you'd probably be killed by a stray arrow in a matter of minutes. Now that we're no longer in the Stone Age, we have a significant upgrade in our weapons. When talking about weapons in this era, keep in mind that the invention of bronze armor and the bow and arrow changed warfare strategies significantly. For example, if you were a soldier in an ancient Egyptian war, you had to keep your eyes peeled for bowmen and flying arrows at all times. Warfare at the beginning of the Bronze Age was pretty similar to the end of the Stone Age. But even when they did come around to the invention of metal weapons such as the bronze axe, bronze did not always equal better. For example, for most of this time period, most societies still didn't make arrow tips out of bronze because bronze arrow tips were duller than obsidian and more expensive than bone arrow tips. Furthermore, they didn't want to bother spending money on an arrowhead that would probably end up never found again. And as far as other weapons went, a flint mace or axe blow was just as damaging as a strike from a copper one. Because of these reasons, copper knives and swords still coexisted alongside stone, bludgeons, and arrowheads for a long time in the Bronze Age. Warfare was much more organized and strategic than the Stone Age. Armies would use advanced melee formations such as the phalanx, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder using shields for protection and striking their enemies with spears and swords. I think we need to talk about how cool chariots were at this point. For example, in the Battle of Kadesh, chariots were a relatively new technology, only having been invented a couple centuries into the Bronze Age. Chariots were basically the world's first car, with only 2 horsepower. And just like modern-day cars, chariot technology improved over time. For example, at some point in history, the lighter 2-wheel chariot was a new design that made it faster and more maneuverable. than the earlier models. Also, keep in mind that chariots were considered the cool vehicle back then, and most normies in battle didn't even get one. In this era, fortified cities became more common, and with that came the dawn of siege warfare, where the enemies of your kingdom would use battering rams and ladders to try to bypass your city's defenses, and you would have probably been instructed to shoot them with bows and arrows or throw hot boiling oil and stones at them while they try to climb their ladders. Battles in the Bronze Age typically took place in plains and open fields. Was this because everyone became more civilized than simply resorting to guerrilla warfare tactics? No. The leaders of the battles probably just wanted to make sure that there was enough room to do victory donuts in their sweet new chariots after winning the fight. The Iron Age. Well, now we're in the Iron Age, and unsurprisingly, just like the Bronze Age, the Iron Age is categorized by iron. Historians weren't really creative with making these names. In this time period, war was primarily fought over control of resources, as usual, although the definition of valuable resources changed slightly. You see, at every point up until now, fertile land and water was fought for. But now that most people had learned a thing or two about metal forging, valuable minerals like iron were in high demand. Add to this the fact that various religious sects were doing a not very good job at coexisting. While it isn't agreed upon how legitimate it was as an actual event, one famous war that supposedly took place in this time period and has pretty strong evidence for it happening was the Trojan War, a battle between Greece and Troy from the 12th century BC. This battle allegedly broke out after Paris of Troy kidnapped Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Talk about low, dude. Anyways, war in the Iron Age was categorized by double-edged iron swords, spears with iron tips, and even daggers. They used shields constructed of wood and leather, and metal maces. Ouch. Like the other time periods, they used advanced formations in war, making a turtle shell type shape with soldiers' shields. Defensively, cities were within very guarded walls, which might sound like a good idea until you realize that enemies could lay siege on you at any moment. And without water or food coming in, the odds of survival under siege got lowered every single day. Enemies of your city would even build towers to jump the wall, or tunnel under the wall to get within your kingdom. The Iron Age shared a lot of similarities with the Bronze Age, just with some minor and some major developments. The medieval era. In the medieval era, war was waged by monarchs and nobles to gain either political power or to expand their territory. If you've been following along in this video, you've probably noticed a common theme. One of the biggest wars in the medieval period was the Crusades, which in a nutshell were organized by Western European Christians after centuries of Muslim wars of expansion. In the Crusades, the primary objective was to stop the expansion of the Muslim states and reclaim the Holy Land in the Middle East for Christianity, and recapture previously Christian territories. During the medieval era, weapons advanced a lot. Notable weapons of this time period include longswords, lances, which could be thrown from far away, and the Morning Star, which is not as friendly as it sounds. This was a spiky ball on a chain that was designed for crushing knights' armor. Also, they didn't just have mere bows anymore. They had crossbows, which had a huge range advantage, and could even pierce a knight's plate armor. Trebuchets existed too, but unless you were an idiot who got in the way of the projectile path, or you lived in a city that it was being aimed at, they weren't really something to worry about. You could probably just run to the side of the field, and it wouldn't be able to adjust its aim fast enough. Battles in medieval times were not as chaotic as their depictions in movies and story. As one Redditor pointed out, if you stayed in your crowd, keeping your enemy only in front of you while being surrounded by your friends left, right, and behind, your chances of survival increased heavily. Disciplined and organized shield formations allowed smaller armies to hold off much larger forces than they should have been able to, with coordination and skilled teamwork. Additionally, a small group known as the Charge Cavalry, which consisted of heavily armored knights on armored horses, would break into enemy lines, allowing the rest of the army to seep into the cracks of the battle line in order to divide up the army into smaller groups. Men in most medieval wars throughout history were arranged in the most natural formation, also known as the line formation. The larger the battle is, the more important it was to keep the line together. Shock troops, which were knights with lances, swords, and shields, were intended to break enemy ranks and shatter the infantry. And that is why the battle formation we mentioned earlier were used. Keeping your shields tight to hold the line was the #1 determinant of whether or not you would lose a war. And believe it or not, this was a shock to me, evidence shows that the winners of medieval wars often suffered very minimal casualties. Siege was also an integral part of war at this time, with armies relying heavily on catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. Another tactic that was used that we mentioned earlier was cutting off supplies to the castle that was being besieged. In reality though, medieval warfare was rough. Regardless of ideals of chivalry, the wars in the medieval era were just as or more savage than the ones from previous eras. This is because medieval times were still a transitional period to more structured forms of war. Early modern era. In this time period, military conquest was one way in which monarchs and empires looked to acquire new land and further spread their wings. Wars were fought for all the same reasons as the last, as well as fights for political power struggles between emerging dynasties and nation states, as well as the desire for economic trading dominance. Events such as the War War of the Spanish Succession comprised one such cause. In this age, there were many skirmishes between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. Additionally, one famous war from this period was the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. The 30-Year War was one of the most catastrophic wars in European history. What started as a religious conflict between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire was soon enlarged into a border dispute involving some of the greatest powers in Europe. This war brought widespread famine, disease, and depopulation, especially in the German states. In 1648, the war finally ended with a treaty known as the Peace of Westphalia. What was war like in the early modern era? Well, the introduction and wide usage of gunpowder weapons pretty much defined war in the early modern era. Muskets, cannons, and other firearms completely changed the nature of combat and rendered most medieval techniques, such as cavalry charges, completely useless. Many battles were characterized by vast formations of troops and a strategy known as the pike and shot, where musketeers fired a bunch of shots while pikemen protected them from enemy cavalry. So basically, it was spawn camping. Heavy artillery like cannons were mainly used in sieges because they could easily break through fortified city walls. Sieges were frequent, as many armies sought to take cities and fortresses of the most strategic importance, sometimes leading to long, exhausting standoffs. Like I mentioned, this time period saw the development of gunpowder weapons. The musket replaced both swords and bows as the primary infantry weapon. Cannons were also used in combat because of their ability to reduce fortifications, essentially destroying them from a safe distance. The first musket was the matchlock musket, but over time it was improved into the flintlock musket because flint was far more reliable. Gunpowder not only influenced the weapons, but also the battle styles of this time period. This change led to linear infantry formations where soldiers stood in a relatively long, straight line to have as much firepower from their muskets as possible. Cavalry units were still sometimes used, although the invention of muskets made soldiers way less privy to undergoing these strategies. And unlike the last era, urban warfare became much more frequent, as developed cities rose to political and economic prominence, like Vienna and Paris. Like mentioned previously, during sieges, food supplies would typically run low, and everyone, including soldiers and civilians, had to survive on whatever was available to eat. Thus, many of them resorted to eating rats, horses, and dogs, and in some cases, entire towns starved to death during extended sieges. The modern era and present day. Modern day, here we go. In the modern era, ideological confrontations came at the forefront of wars, especially during the Cold War, where the clash between capitalism and communism led to numerous proxy wars worldwide. New reasons for war and conflict included oil and other energy commodities and the drive for industrial power. Wars in the 19th and 20th centuries had many examples of disputes over nationalism, self-determination, independence movements, the American Civil War, and decolonization struggles in Africa and Asia. Additionally, warfare in the 21st century saw the rise of terrorism motivated by extremist ideologies and regional grievances. The biggest war in the modern era, of course, was World War II. World War II, from 1939 to 1945, determined the fate of the modern-day world. This war was driven by expansionist ambitions, especially those from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Thus, it naturally clashed with the polar opposite ideologies of fascism and democracy. This war saw countless major battles reverberating throughout Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. And as we all know, it ended with the defeat of the Axis powers and the toppling of the fascist regime, which established the United States of America and the Soviet Union as superpowers in the transitional period into the Cold War. What was war like in the modern era? Modern warfare with today's advanced technologies includes firearms, tanks, aircraft, and missiles, and of course, nuclear weapons. Contemporary wars use any number of variations in attack style, sometimes combining traditional military battle structure with guerrilla warfare.
They're in the tree!
And in the modern day, rifles and handguns are standard weapons to every soldier. Howitzers provide long-range firepower, and missiles, both cruise and ballistic, provide precision strikes against enemy targets. The invention of nuclear weapons opened an entirely new scale of destructive capability that changed the tide, context, and rules of war forever. Recently, cyber warfare tools have been added to the game as well, allowing enemy forces to intercept military secrets, gain intel, and even turn electricity off to enemies via EMPs. Additionally, drones have changed the game in modern battles, such as the FPV bombing drones currently being used in the Ukraine war. Besides this, for battles that take place in 2024, for the first time in history, it's pretty much a prerequisite to be fighting on air, land, and sea. Bonus: the future. This is a new one. In any of our time period videos, we have never covered on a hypothetical future, but for this video, I figured, why not try it out? With that being said, we've covered every era of history we know. What about the final era, the future era? Well, although I'm no time traveler, this is just fictional speculation, but in the future, it is possible that physical land and sovereignty will give way to fighting over digital control and power. In dictatorial countries, this would probably include power over free speech and the suppression of controversial information. Besides this, however, wars will be fought for many reasons. reasons. Because at this point, we've progressed so far that any reason we fought a war in the past will probably happen again. Future reasons for war, however, could also include future resources that we don't even know about yet. I'll leave you with a hypothetical to help paint the picture. Imagine the year is 2200. Nowadays, oil money is a thing of the distant past. Up until this point, the most sought after resource was lithium, but a recent breakthrough in supercapacitors makes them the new perfect storage for energy. They can be charged for a single second, last for weeks to months, and hold unimaginable amounts of power in a tiny amount of volume. Basically like Tony Stark's nuclear reactor. After outstanding research reports were released from the once Ivy League Musk University, Elon Musk's research and innovation-oriented university founded in 2045, regarding this new invention, it was an absolute sensation around the world, and even more consequential than the invention of the light bulb. However, there's only one problem with this new technology. The new supercapacitor technology that everyone wants requires a rare mineral called potentia that is currently only found in a little island known as Mergui, formerly known as Fiji. In an interesting twist of fate, nuclear weapons have become completely obsolete, as long before Iran and Afghanistan gained power to nuclear weaponry in 2036, the United Nations pooled billions of dollars into research and development for nuclear defense weapons. The technology that came from this was able to deactivate any and all ICBMs by sending supersonic counter missiles at a nearly unlimited number of missiles. And by 2080, nearly all countries in the world have a nuclear iron dome of mutually assured protection. Because of this, and paired with the new breakthroughs in technology to counter radiation and EMFs, warfare reverts back to something like the World War II era of war, but still far more futuristic. In this warfare, close-range combat is relevant again, and ingenuity gives nations a competitive advantage. Thus, this new supercapacitor was the new holy grail for super advanced combat weapons. From looking back in history, we can conclude that a futuristic war for resources would be far different from the historical examples we've covered thus far. In fact, war might never get waged in the first place in this example, as advanced geospecific information warfare could be utilized first to either keep it from happening in the first place or brainwash the citizens of Mergui to uprise until their government makes a deal that's in favor of the country that's conducting the brainwashing. This is all a future hypothetical, but I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on it because I think this format could be kind of fun. If you guys would enjoy either hypothetical history or hypothetical future, kind of like sci-fi, let me know in the comments because I would love to make videos like that. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. And if you want to watch another video about something in every time period, check out this video about being rich in every time period. Don't forget to subscribe. And like always, trust me, bro.